All right, we're back. It's COMP229 in the fall 2016 semester at Centennial. It's week 3, part 2 of our broadcast. We just did a review, and I did it on purpose because I know people like to see the stuff again, right? I'm not done yet. I need to put this up on GitHub, right? Now, let's do this, right? So remember that in Visual Studio, I can do it with using Team Explorer. Now remember, I checked on that Git, kind of add to Git, right? I want to go to sync. Here's what I want to start with first. So here's sync. Notice that it says, because I've got my GitHub extension, and the extension is that happens one time, Visual Studio wise, right? Packages you can download through NuGet, and you can get them every project. You can require new packages, but extensions are already typically done once or when you want to update them. I want to click on Get Started, and it's going to ask me what I want to name the repository, both remotely and locally. So locally and remotely is going to be called COMP229 F2016 lesson 3, and the same thing for remotely. I want to put it on Centennial. This is where it's going to go, and this is it. It's as easy as clicking Publish. I also can put some information here. Like for example, if I want in my description, I can add things in there like, project setup. Right, there it is, Publish. It's going to create a new repository called COMP229 Fall 2016 Lesson 3, and it should be on GitHub. Let's take a look and see if it's there. So if I go to GitHub, and if I go to Centennial, I should see this now. So now you can see all my code. It's up on there, and you can have an example of where to start if you're going to start a brand new project, right, from scratch. Okay, here's a problem, right? I got my global ASX page. I've got my my web debug file, my package config, all this stuff, but I don't have anything else. How come? Some people had this problem last week, and that's why I'm putting it out there. So when I just did it, I didn't go to changes. I just went to sync, right? I just went to sync. If I click on changes, you can see that I got a ton of changes I made. Like for example, I created my boilerplate here. So I'm going to add all this to the staging area. You got to do this first, right? And if I go up here, I'm going to say created portfolio boilerplate. Right? That's what I did. Right? So commit staged. I'm going to go home, and I'm going to go sync and push. And this is going to push everything, all my changes, including my code, up on GitHub. If I go back to GitHub and refresh, I'll have third commit, which is going to have created my portfolio boilerplate. And if you look at there, I'll have everything. All my pages will be there now, including all my changes that I made to my default ASPX.cs file. Oh, sorry. My site master, .cs file, which includes all this stuff that switched between pages. All that stuff's up there now, so you can see it, just like we did last time. A couple reasons to do the review. One is because people need to see it twice. Sometimes people need to see it 3 times. And they don't want to watch the video again, right? That's number one. And the second thing is sometimes, when you see it the second time, it clicks. First time didn't click. Second time it might click, and you might know what to do. Because remember, on an exam, you won't have the luxury of time, right? Time will not be on your side. You have to create a project live in the room using everything you know how to do, right? And there won't be the time to do it, by watching a video. You won't have time to do that. I won't allow it anyway. I'll allow you to do other things. I'll allow you to look at GitHub examples, but watching a video, it's just going to slow you down, if anything else, which is not what you want. Okay, so I've uploaded things to GitHub, and I've got my boilerplate, and I really wanted to talk about other things today, but I use this as an example of getting started, right? Let's talk to the things we're going to be talking about today for the rest of the time we have together. And by the way, please stop me if you have questions, because that's really important for us to do. All right, so up online, I have a couple of, one PowerPoint today. I was going to put more, but I figured I need to do a review. Because people ask me all kinds of crazy questions. And you know what? If people ask me those kind of questions, it points to a lack of understanding, right? And I don't want to move on before we understand this piece. I'm reading this book, Build Your Own ASP.NET 4 website. But actually we're at ASP.NET 5. I'm going to talk about a couple things, core web application features, and when we're talking about them, also going to be talking about debugging and error handling a little bit too today, right? But a lot more of what we're talking about is a few files that exist on our site. One is our web.config file and our global ASAX file. Those are the two files alongside with everything else that you have in every website, right? Let's talk about those. If you look at the Solution Explorer, you can see that I have those two files, right? And here's my web.config file. Notice that there's about 21 lines of code. In the past, this used to be a lot bigger. Like this code here used to be bigger. Let's take a look at what it has. This is all in XML, right? So this XML basically talks about the configuration of a couple things. One, how we compile. What's our target framework, 4.6.1, right? What kind of compiler are we using? C# compiler, right? And other things we can put in here, right? And we're going to talk about this. This configuration file itself is something that we're not going to be touching too much. But when we want a connection to our database, we're going to put that in here too, right? We want to talk authentication. That's going to go in here, right? All the kind of stuff that we need when we try and control our entire site, anything site-wide. Typically, we want to put it in from a configuration perspective in our web.config file. Okay. Now notice that because it's an XML, it uses tags, opening tags and closing tags, just like HTML, right? It's still markup. All right, it's still markup. That's why it's called XML, right? Markup language, ML, right? So what I want to point out to you, right, is when it comes down to those things, that web config file is where we have a lot of our configuration for the site. And we're going to talk about that. Also, there's something else called a machine.config file, and it's usually located in your C, Windows, Microsoft.NET, Framework, Version, Config folder, right? You see what I'm talking about here. So if I go there, so go C, quick access, C. And you know, I just expanded this bloody thing and I only have 6 gig left. I keep on, Microsoft is hungry. It keeps on eating my stuff. I started out 80 gigs. Now I'm at 150 gigs. It's still asking for more space. And it keeps asking for more space. But let's keep going. So I'll go to Windows. So if I look at this configuration, here's Windows, right? And if you look at where I'm going to go to, so look at the thing, Microsoft.NET framework. So if I go Microsoft.NET framework, and then the version, which is this one, right? And if I look down at these things here, you can see that there's going to be a config folder under config. What I want to look at is machine.config. Here's machine.config, right? Now this config is for the machine, right? This is like for every project, not just for all solutions. The configuration for my Visual Studio, right? Don't mess with this file, whatever you do. I'm telling you where it is, but please, whatever you do, do not mess with this file. Let me take a look at Notepad and see what it's got in there. It's really an XML file again. It's like the web config file. It's about the configuration of your application, the application itself, right? So these are the two files, the 3 files that you have on every, you know, starting off from application level, machine.config, to, you know, we're talking about solution level, which is web.config, right? From a configuration perspective. The other one that we're going to talk about today is global ASAX. And think about any kind of global events, like when my application loads, and when my application, not the page, my application, and when my session starts, and when my application exit, and all those kind of things. All of that lifecycle stuff for the whole application happens in my global ASAX file. All right, so it's important to understand these 3 things. We're really going to be working with global ASAX, right, as well as my web.config file. Those 2 files we're going to be working with throughout the course, right? Even when we talk about other, you know, when we work with MVC, so Model View Controller version of ASP.NET, we'll still be using a web.config and some kind of global ASAX file. Those things aren't going to change. Even the way we connect to our database is going to be the same, right? So there's going to be some skills we can carry forward from the first half of the semester to the second half of the semester. But there's also going to be some stuff we're going to have to close one eye and never use again, right? Just letting you know, because Remember, web forms is older technology that Microsoft came up with years ago, and still there's lots of stuff out there in the government, right? Like 80% penetration of this stuff, but it's going to go eventually. It's going to change to something like MVC or MVC Core, which is the latest technology. All right, let's talk about our web.config page a little bit more. So if you look at the PowerPoint up online, I go in detail about what it is, right? One of the things to look at is you can always do things in your config file, like, you know, kind of put together an app settings portion. Like, for example, if I want to select or kind of configure a support email, I can do that site-wide, as an example, inside my web.config, and this is what it would look like. So I have app settings, right? So if I was going to type it in, it actually gives you some code hinting. So if I was going to type that in, so if I was at app settings, notice that it gives me the app settings tag, right? And then inside my app settings tag, I can go in here and I can develop a new key. So I can say add key, and the key would be what it was almost like the variable name of what we call it. So for example, support email. Email, there we go. And then you would have a value, so the key value pairs, there's the value, right? And my value would be the email address, like for example, support at example.com, right? So again, you can do this in your web config, and we're going to do more of this kind of stuff where we have some kind of outer tag and then some kind of inner tag with some attributes, a key and value pair, something like that. Notice that we have them up here. Language is an attribute with a value, right? The type of extension, which is .cs for C# files. This is all the configuration we need to set up C#. Also, notice that it detects the compiler for VB if we wanted to mix in VB type files, Visual Basic, which we wouldn't because Visual Basic is totally different and we wouldn't want to do that. What if I got rid of it, right? Do I need this piece right here, which is compile language VB? Do I need it? Like, could I rid myself of this whole piece from here, right? This is where the tag closes, all the way to here. Would it break my code? What do you think? Would it break my code if I took it out, the VB part? Visual Basic, here I'm doing C#. Am I doing any Visual Basic in my code? No. Let's see if it happens if I take it out. Worst case, it's going to give us an error, and we'll figure it out. So I'm going to cut it out and save it. So now I've reduced my compilers to only one type of compiler. Let's run this thing and see what happens, right? Remember, if it doesn't build, it'll give me build errors in the bottom. Now it built. And if I run this thing, and if it runs, then we know we don't need that in our web.config. See? I don't need it. It still runs, right? Because I'm using C#. If I try to use VB now, it wouldn't compile, right? Because it'd be like, oh, what is VB? I don't know what VB is, right? But we don't have VB. So this is just, I'm just showing you an example of that right out of the box, Microsoft provides support for both those languages, VB and C#. We just don't need it, so we can remove it. Okay. Let's talk about other things. So that's one thing that the web config file will be for. We don't want to monkey with this too much. The more we monkey with these files, web config and global ASAX, we can have a huge effect on our entire website, right? We're going to be doing it, but we're going to be doing it in the right places. A lot of times, we're going to be putting a lot of stuff in our system.web section of our website. And if you notice, if I go back over here, do you see a system.web section? Yes, it is. We do. We see it right up here. Here's our system.web section. There's a lot of stuff we're going to be putting inside this section, which means we're going to be adding in additional tags. So example would be if I open the tag, you can see that these are all the different things we can put in there. For example, authentication and authorization. Hey, here's a question for you. What's the difference between authentication and authorization? Unfortunately, the names start the same, auth. So it kind of throws people off. It's a trick question. So Wendell, what do you think it is? Authentication and authorization. We're going to talk about security later on, so don't worry if you don't know it now. But I'm going to be talking about this throughout. Don't look it up. Just try it out. Yes. Yes and no. What is it, Wendell? Do you know? Okay, so when you log in with your username and password, you authenticate. It authenticates. It means, yes, I know who you are, right? Authorization says, okay, now what can you do? Right? I might be authenticated. They know who I am. Authentication is identity. I know who you are. Okay, now what can you do? Right? That's authorization, right? Authorization means, hey, I can open this door, right? With my badge. That's I'm authenticated, but I'm not authorized to go into every door in the building, right? Even me, I can't go into every building, every door. There might be some doors that I'm not authorized to go into. That's authorization. But I'm authenticated. The system knows who I am. So if I go up to a door and go bing, right, with my badge, it's going to say, wait a minute, that's Tom, but Tom doesn't have authorization to enter this door. That's the difference between authentication and authorization. Remember that, because we're going to get back to it when we talk about security. So we can do that. We put that in our system.web section as well. And there's other things, if you notice, we can do here. If you scroll down, there's globalization, there's identity, there's all kinds of stuff we can do. Sitemap, web controls, web services, and there's a bunch of other stuff we can do. Trust and membership, and a bunch of other stuff, okay? But we're not going to do all those things. I'm just showing you if you open up any kind of tag inside of a section, like for example in compilers, let's go back to compilers for a second, right? If I go to compile, I can do only compiler. That's the only one that's available in compilers, right? You see? I can't put just anything anywhere I want. It has to go in a specific section. App settings, again, I mean, I made a key, I added a key, but you can also do a bunch of other stuff. I can clear or remove. I can add, clear, or remove. I use the add. That's the only one that's available there. Okay? What about at the configuration level? That's the main level, the root level. I can do other things too, lots of stuff. App settings, assembly binding, config sections. Hey, here's something, connection strings. We're going to be doing that. That's something we're going to be doing at the configuration level. When we connect to a database, we're going to have a connection string section, right? And also, we might have something called entity framework, because we're going to be talking about entity framework in this course, right? So those two things will be in here, right? As well as other things that are here as well. Startup, and there's a bunch of other stuff you can think of that are different sections that basically are adding to our configuration, right? So that's what our web.config file is in a nutshell. When you see our web.config file, it does things like adds configuration details for our entire site, our application, okay? Now, our global ASAX file is a different matter altogether. It has a bunch of events. Example, application start, right? That has an event. I can do something whenever my application starts. That means when I first launch it on my server, right? So my application starts on my server. First time I launch it, it'll do something. And when the application restarts, it'll do something again, right? But it won't fire more than once. That only will work one time. At the beginning, the first time, it'll do something with application start, but never again. Now there's other ones I can put in here, right? Now here's the thing I can't do in this. I can't press Control Space and then think about stuff I can do, because this is just hitting all of C#, right? So that won't help me. But you could look at the global ASAX class. Notice that it inherits from system.web.http application, right? So if you wanted to know all the stuff that's included, you can always look it up online, and I recommend that whenever you kind of hit a new file you've never seen before. If I do like global.asax, and then for web forms, right, which is what you want to look at, if I kind of do a search on that, again, what you want to look at is this global ASAX file here on MSDN, Microsoft Content Network here, right? So if I go there and you can see what it is, and this is .NET Framework 1.1 from then, that's when it was first made, right? You know, it'll tell you about ASP.NET applications, right? And here's the HTTP application class, right, which it inherits from. So if I look at this HTTP application class, right, and if I look at the recommended version, this document is not maintained, right? I can also click on different versions, like for example, .NET Framework 4, right? Which is, we're using 4.6 right now, 4.6.1. Different .NET Framework and different ASP.NET. Don't try and mix those things up. .NET Framework 4 means .NET Framework for C#, F#, VB, and all programming languages. That's the underlying layer of ASP.NET, which is the way we connect to the web, right? Now look at Visual Studio 2010, right? We can also look at other versions, right? .NET Framework current version, right? And then it gives you some examples of the HTTP application class, right? For example, the application class itself has different kinds of information, but the one we want to look at is for the events. If I look at the events, a list of events, and these are all the event delegates that it says, right? So whatever the event handler list is what we want to look at, and it's not really giving us that. So let's go back. Sometimes we're looking for, you have to search correctly, and I got this pretty big here. Let's go back from 150, let's go back down to 100%, just to give you the right thing. So I want to, global, well, here's some examples of the HTTP handler class, but that's not what I want. I want global ASAX event, right? So again, I want to look at, oh, there it is, perfect, life cycle for IS5 and IS6. And there's other versions here as well, right? All right, so let's take a look at this. Now, the life cycle is what we want to look at. This is perfect, right? So the client goes to the internet, hits the IIS server, takes care of the application manager, and then notice that the arrow is the double arrow. So it goes through the IIS into the application manager, which is ASP.NET, and then returns everything back to the client, right? That's the idea here. But the great thing is, it talks about all of the application event lifecycle. Like, for example, things like begin request, authentication request. All these different things you're going to see are going to come up, right? Like application start is one of the things we want to see. Okay. So just want to point it out that you can probably find out most of the information. Here's for IS7. And sorry, application level events, what I really want. There we go. Application level events, right? Application error that's an event type, and so on. So what happens if you lose one of these files? Like, okay, so I'm going to go back. So let's say, oh man, I don't have a global ASAX file. Let's say I delete it. Do I really need a global ASAX file first? That's the other thing you have to ask yourself. Is it optional? So I'm going to take this file, global ASAX, and delete it. And you're like, oh no, Tom, what have you done? You've killed my file. Now we're in trouble. I can't undo that. It's true. Can't undo this change, right? However, I can add it back in. First of all, let's see if it runs without that global ASAX file. Will it run? Remember, there's things that are required. Remember, we checked on that web forms checkbox to see if it worked. Well, it compiled, right? It compiled. And you can see that without a global ASAX file, I'm still okay, right? What it does is it gives the ability to inject code at different events in our life cycle, the whole application life cycle. So if I want to show you all those events and I don't remember them, right, I can always add the file back in. Right-click, I can go add, and I can go new item, right? And then if I type in global, right, global, you can see that global application class is what I want, and click add. Now this is going to add that global ASAX back in and include all of the default event lifecycle events. So application start, session start, application begin request, like we saw, application authentication request. So when you authenticate, what happens? You can do something, right? Even logging, you can even log stuff. So when an event happens, you can log everything on the console. So okay, the user's asking me to log in. Okay, good. Log it to the console. Whatever time I have an authentication request, or every time the application starts, log it to the console. Application start. Here's an example of that. Let's try it together. So I'm going to say debug.writeLine, right? So debug.writeLine. By the way, if it doesn't come up, remember what the rule is. You can use dot. We're going to space dot, right? Let's talk about it in a second, or control dot. And we're going to say things like application started, right? I want this to appear inside of our application, and I'm going to press control dot, right, to come up with the thing that I'm missing. So if I see this underline, means I'm missing a using statement, right? Because I know debug works. So control dot, if I hover over it, it says, hey, add in using system.diagnostics. And then when I do that, this is going to turn this teal color, right? And then now I can use this. It's a class, right? The system diagnostics.debug class inside the system diagnostics namespace. All right, cool. Let's run this thing and see if it works, right? So run it. I'm using my global ASX.cs file now. Before I wasn't using it, now I am. But are you going to notice anything on the web page? No, because it's not a web, it's not a client-side thing at all. It's actually handled by the server. Even if I go here, and if I go inspect, and if I go to console, there's nothing. The debug doesn't happen here. Like I said before, it happens here, inside this part here. And I need an output window. If you look at the output window down here, right? When my application starts, this is my debug window, right? There's going to be a place, like down here, where it says application started, right? This tells you it got through all these files, read all these files, and finally, when my application started, it happened right here at this point. And then a bunch of other stuff happened, right? So this is telling you that when we're defining the application lifecycle. When I say lifecycle, it's when the application gets born, lives, and then dies, right? And it dies when we exit the application. Typically, in a real-world web application, it never dies because it's always on, right? It just kicks off when it starts, and then it does this. Okay, but there's other events we can hook into. We're going to talk about the session start event here. So when the session starts, we can do something, right? Also, when application errors out, if something happens, or when the session ends, we can do that too. Or when the application ends, when we stop the application, we can do those things, right? So all of those events are things you can do things with, capture, and so on. All right. So global ASAX file. I'm talking about this because, and by the way, this is the system.web, the web.config file. It talks about things like different things you can add in, authentication, authorization, and so on, all in the system.web section, right? I'm not going to go into details here, but if you wanted to look at what they are, these are the places that you can look for what they do, just to be familiar with them. I'm not going to test you on them, but I want you to know that the web.config file contains different sections, right? Okay. Now, here is the global ASAX file. And application start is the most common place to do things like initialization. So if I want to initialize something for my entire application, like for example, certain variables, application start in my global ASAX file is the place to do it. Why? It always kicks in for the first time when my application starts, right? It's not page dependent, right? Because remember, the way web forms works is the code, right? By default, I have a code behind file. And whenever I hit a page, right, that code behind file triggers, right? Each page has a page load event. Each page, right? So that means that when I go back to my files, my about.aspx page has an about.aspx.cs code behind file. And if I look there, you can see that each page has a page load event. So when I go to my about page, if I want to say that I'm here, I could do something like this. I could say something like, and each page I could do this. I could say something, well, do some kind of debug.writeline and say which page I'm on. But if I'm going to do it for each page, I might as well do it on my site master. Because on my site master page, I also have a site.master.cs file. And as you saw before, I have this set active page that triggers for every page. Well, guess what? I can also pump out my page title if I want, like this. So debug. Notice that debug is not found again because I haven't had the using statement added in for this page. It's page specific. I haven't added in that namespace. So debug.writeline. And inside there, I can say something like, whatever the name of the page is, right, which is page.title, right, plus some kind of message started, or started, let's say, or loaded. Let's say we'll say loaded. It makes more sense, right? So when the page loads, we're going to say debug.writeline. Let's load the page, right? So control dot. We're going to say using system.diagnostics, we'll add that in, save it, so that every page will have the page title pumped out. Whenever I go to a page, it'll show the page title that's loaded, right, kind of stuff, oops, in the debug output window. So if I run it, but only when you run with debugging. If you don't run with debugging, you won't see it, right? So here's my debug. Here's my page. Notice that it loads up my page for the first time, my default.aspx page, right? Here's my home page. And now there's a couple messages, right? Here's my application started, and then here's my home loaded, right? Plus a couple of other things I did. A couple of other commands I did with my home. For example, I drew my page, right? Okay, let's see that this thing can work. So take a look over here to see what happens when I click on something. Like for example, let's see if I change the size of my content. So now I'm mobile, mobile specific page, like I talked about before, the little hamburger that comes up, right? So here's home loaded, and if I go click on this, and if I click on projects, you can see that projects is going to load, and I should expect to see projects loaded, right? And the same thing goes if I click on services, right? And if I click on about, so you can see that it does that. So it takes a look at the page title, and it pumps out these things. Guys, debug.writeline is a great debugging tool. Why? Because we can see values in there. You can pump up values. If you're not sure what's happening and you want to see the output of what a class is doing or a value, this is the way to do it. It's a quick and dirty way to do it. You can also, of course, do things like debugging techniques, right? And Visual Studio has a fantastic debugger, and you guys should have already seen that in Programming 1 and Programming 2, right? If you took Programming 1 and Programming 2, saying you should have already understood the debugger. Well, how does that debugger work? Well, the great thing is it works. Notice that I have a gutter, right? Especially for my pages, my C#, I have a gutter that's in here. So let's say when I come to my, I want to see what my page title is here. I want to inspect that. So I put a breakpoint in the gutter. If I click on the gutter, right, in here, I can put a breakpoint just by clicking, right? And what this is saying is that the breakpoint, when I run my code again, it's going to stop here, and it's going to show me this breakpoint, and I can inspect the value of different variables and the state of my application at this particular point in time. Okay, let's try this. So run with debugging. If I don't run with debugging, it's not going to be the same. Okay, here's the breakpoint. Look, debug.writeline. It even got there. Well, let's take a look at my locals window. If you look at my locals window, you can see that I get a bunch of stuff going on here. And I'm going to kind of make this a little larger for you to see, right? So remember that this page here, this partition here tells us a couple things. I've got my diagnostic tools, which means the kind of events that my application is listening for. An example of this would be get. When you see the get request, this is a request that's coming from the user that's asking for the root of my file, this get request, right? Now I hit a breakpoint. It says the page load on the site master, line 15, is when the breakpoint is being hit. This is this one. Okay? That's what this is doing. Now here, what this is happening on this side, this locals window, is showing us different variables at this particular time when we hit our event. We haven't executed that line yet, line 15. We just stopped there before execution, right? And if you look, I can also look at this. I can see what the E is and the sender. Those are two objects that are part of my page load event. I have my sender object, right? As you notice. And also, I have this E. And if I hover over at this particular point, it tells you what it is, if you really want to. You can actually look at what this thing is. And if you keep going down, you can see it's empty, right? Same thing with the sender object. If I click on the sender object, I can see that it's the site master, and these are all the elements of the sender object and their values, right? So you can really do a deep inspection if you want to. For example, my app relative virtual path is the tilde sign site master. That's what this path is for this particular site, right? Okay, let's take a look down here. Same thing. If I actually go down here, you can look at the same information, but in more detail in your locals window. Let's do that again. These are all the things I have, right? Okay, let's step forward. Now the controls up on the top, from a debugging perspective, if you haven't seen this before, there's these controls up here. Show next statement, step into, right? Step into means I'm going to go to the next line. Step over, skip it, right? Step out means go to the next, finish this method and go back to the calling method. That's what it means, right? So I want to go to the next one. So step into F11. Now this actually activates or runs my debug.writeLine, right? And now we should see home loaded because that's my debug.writeLine for that page. That's the next thing that ran. So here's my breakpoint. I stepped over it. Now I'm back to my breakpoint again because remember, my site master would load another time. Let's take a look. On the left, I have other information that I didn't have before. For example, I have my system.webui page.title is home. That's the state of that variable, right? And my string.concat returned home loaded because that's what I put together. Here's my home, and here's loaded, and it kind of outputted that string in the in this particular one, this debug.writeLine. So why am I showing you all this information? Because sometimes we have to deeply inspect an application. It doesn't matter if it's a C# application, VB, or ASP.NET. And our tools, Visual Studio, is amazing. That's one thing that's really awesome at inspecting our or doing debugging. All right. If I step over, as an example, or step out of, right, I should be able to go back to my page, right? Because I'm stopping debugging. I'm basically going over that page. But if I go back to my next page, my projects page, it's going to go back to be debugging again, right? Because now my projects page is going to be hit. And if you notice, I page loaded my site master again, right? Because I requested my projects page. Here's my project page. And because this is on my site master, it's going to do this again. And if I can do the same thing again, right? And it can show me what page I'm at. My page title is now projects, right? Okay, let's stop debugging. And the one thing I want to do is take away my breakpoint by clicking again. So I click it, I set it, click again, and then take it away. That easy. And you can have multiple breakpoints throughout your code, especially if something's not working the way you think it's supposed to work. So I know some of you haven't. Who has never seen that before? Like from programming 1 or programming 2. You guys all saw it, right? You never saw it before? Good. So if I get one person that hasn't seen it and we've seen it now, wonderful. Because sometimes what happens is every teacher teaches a slightly different way, and you may have missed it, or maybe you didn't remember it. Or maybe they taught it, but you didn't focus on it, right? It's good to see that stuff so we hit all those aspects. All right, so debugging is done. So global ASAX, it takes care of our application lifecycle. And again, there's different events. You can see that they're all listed here. As a reference card, I put them in for you. If you really want to do something with different things, like for example, application start, application end, application on error, any kind of unhandled error. This doesn't mean page errors. It means unhandled error. Like if you cause the page to stop because you're doing a division by 0 or something crazy like that, and you're not catching it, right? Was that? It's an exception, but something that's not caught. So I haven't put it inside a try catch or something like that. I haven't provisioned for some kind of exception with a calculation, let's say, right? It'll error out. My whole application will crash, right? And then you can put some kind of event to tell me what happened. What was the exception, right? If you really want to, and other things. I listed them all here for your viewing pleasure, right? I'm not going to test you on them. I just want you to understand. If I look at web config in your mind, if I ever test you on it, it's going to be, oh yeah, web config, that's configuration for my entire site. Global ASAX file, that's where I do all my event handling for my application, for my web application lifecycle. All right, that's what I want you to take away from that. All right, I'm going to move on. I want to talk about the ability for us to using application state, the application state object, right, as well as session state. Now, there's different ways of saving information. And imagine if, remember, because HTTP is a stateless protocol, right? I connect, and the server forgets who I am next time I connect, right? But with ASP.NET, we have something called view state, right? But beyond that, what if I want my users to all have access to a piece of data that keeps updating all the time? Example, the old site counter. Remember those site counters used to exist? We don't use them anymore. They're really bad form. If you see a site counter that goes 1, 2, 5,000 users, right? To give your own site props, right? That you have 5,000 visits this month or whatever it is, right? And you reset every month if you want to, right? That's nice, but it's really like kind of gauche nowadays. We don't do it too much because it's not really that efficient, and it's really ugly to have a site counter on your site. But back in the day, right? Like back in the 90s, right? I'm talking that far back, right? It was cool to do. So how would you keep track of visits on the server? Like you'd have to have some kind of server object to keep track. Application state is how we did it, right? We can use the application state as a container for a piece of data that we can update. Now, this is really important because you can put a lot of different things in application state. Think about it as a static container that we can assign any variable we want of any type that'll always be remembered across every single user that comes to our site. That's why we use application state. Can you think about some things that you might want to put in, like for show the users? Something that you want to share, with the user. You may not be able to think about it right now, but there might come a time where you sit there and go, I want every user to have this access to this data, right? That's where you put it, application state. All right? And the way we use it is we use a dictionary. All right? So session state and application state. Session state is like application state. Think about the session object when I think about a session as keeping track of data. So it's a session container. So imagine if I can declare a dynamic object, a dynamic variable, right? I don't tell application or session what type of variable it is. It'll store whatever you put in there. Objects, variables, strings, integers, whatever you want. But you just have to name it with quotations. And this is called using a dictionary type. Like example like this. So I say, here's my application, and then in quotations, that's my variable name. My dynamic variable is called site name. I can access site name again, right? Because it's application level, it's global. It's a global variable that's available to every single user, right? A good example of this is who's logged in, right? Who's logged in? If I had a group of people, if I want to show everybody, as soon as you're logged in, to everybody, I want to share who's logged in. I could put a collection, a list of names of people that are currently accessing the site, right? And I could store it somewhere in an application level container. And I can make that whatever I want. It's dynamic. It means I don't have to sit there and go, site name is a string and you can only hold it, whatever you want. But when you put something into it one time, it knows what it is, right? So you can't just put whatever you want. And then once you do it, in order for you to get stuff back from it, you have to cast it like this. By default, you would have to cast it as a string. It has no toString method. It doesn't have a toString method like we're used to. So you can't go like application site name dot toString. It won't work, right? You have to do this. This is kind of notation here, which is casting. That's what it's called. Actually, this is old C-style casting notation. That's what this is. This works in C#, C++, C, a bunch of other other languages, including things like JavaScript. There's even notation like this for JavaScript. We just use angle brackets for the notation, right? But this is the way we do it. We say, okay, application site name is a string. We're forcing it to be a string. C#'s actually come up with a better way of doing this, right? When we want to store variables globally, right? And we can use a new keyword, right, or if you will, called as, right? So instead of casting, right, we can convert it with the keyword as. Let me see if I put it in here in my slides. And I think I give you an example of that further down. Here we go. Here's as. So instead of casting it as a string, I can say, hey, take the application site name and it's as a string. We can use the as keyword, right? So instead of casting it with, it's more, actually, it's a little clearer from a notation perspective. So string app name would be the name of my site as a string. I want to kind of make it as a string. Now, I want to also test to see if that exists. It's important to understand that if it exists or not, because sometimes we haven't set it. By declaring it like this, right? I haven't set it to anything yet. I have to assign it some kind of value, right? Like the previous slides. Right? If I go back to the previous slide, you can see that I assigned it a value here. But if I haven't done this yet, right, and I try and test it, it'll fail. So I want to check to see if it's null. If it's not null, then I have assigned something to it. And if I've assigned something to it, then do some work, right? So I always want to check if it's null. That's the first thing. So is it null? But it's a place that I can store data across the entire site. And there's a really good example in here. If I want to, by the way, if I don't do anything to add, I just assign something when I add. But if I want to remove my my dictionary definition in the application object, I need to use the remove method. If I remove all objects, I can use the remove all method, and it removes all the objects out of my application, right? So imagine I want to keep track of all the users who are logged in, and I want to show that, let's say, for example, Eddie's logged in and Javid's logged in. You know, as an example, let's say, you know, I got Wendell, I'm logged in, a bunch of other people are logged in, right? And I can show that in a list, a string list, if you will, right? Somewhere in my application, right? But I can store it here, right? It's global. Every user will see it. When a user logs out, then I can update my application who's logged in object, right? And I'm making this up, who's logged in, right? And then it's going to have less names. Make sense? So that's one good use of it. In the book, as well as on the slides, and I'm not going to go into it, it details how to put together a, you know, like I said, some kind of, you know, counter. If you want to count how many times a page has been accessed, that's another use that used to be used for. And I can do that by this code. So here's an example of that. So here's first of all, we check if my application page counter is not equal to null. And I'm casting it as int. This is another way of doing it. And my page counter is greater than or equal to 10. Then I do something. Else, if my page counter, right here it is, if my application page counter is equal to null, so it's never been made before, then my application counter is equal to 1, because I've gone there for the first time, right? Else, on this one, my application page counter is equal to, I'm casting it as an integer, whatever it is, plus 1. So I'm basically updating, and I can use plus equal to 1 if I really want to as well, right? So what I'm doing is I'm incrementing my page counter until it gets to 10, right? When my page counter is greater than or equal to 10, kill it. And when it's killed, it'll come back as 1. It'll go 1 to 10, and when it goes beyond 10, it'll go back to 1 in this particular case. Now I don't know why I would want to do that, but it's an example of how you can use a page counter and how you can use the application object with a dynamic dictionary definition of a variable to assign data and display it to every user on the site simultaneously, right? Questions around this? Will we have call for this? No, but I want to talk about it so you've seen it, because, you know, I want you to know if you ever see application objects, sometimes we use the application object to solve problems, right, as a workaround. Because we don't have another solution that's easy to do, we can't think of it. So application object, it's like a global variable. So typically, I would say don't use it as much as possible. And also, it's heavy. The more we store in the application object, it becomes heavier. The more and more we store, it slows down stuff for the user. Yeah. There's different ways of doing it, but if else, in this particular case, the book, this is right out of the book, right? This isn't me, all right? But what we're doing here is we're first to check the first part on the top here, right? This part, it checks to see if it exists. If it's not equal to null, that means it's been set. If my page counter dictionary definition of this variable, right? This is another way of doing it. If I go application and quotations page counter, it says the variable page counter that's part of the application object. That's what I'm talking about. It's almost like saying application dot page counter. If I was going to use dot accessing, that's the equivalent. But I haven't set the object. There is no page counter property, right, for application. But I'm using the dictionary quotations to assign one dynamically. So I'm saying, hey, does it exist? If it's equal to null, it doesn't exist, right? If it's not equal to null, that means it's already been assigned. So therefore, I can do something with it, right? And VB, it's equal to nothing. I think the keyword is nothing, not null. If you're a VB person, right? I'm not a VB person anymore, but just saying. All right, so that's that. So session state, right, is very similar to application state, but the difference between application state and session state is session state works for an individual user. So it can tell if it's you that's logged in. So if you logged in, it'll know it's you compared to everybody else, right? We use session state to say, well, if a user accesses the, this session, it's only for that user. So an example is if some other user comes in and does the same thing, he'll have his own session variable. It'll be named the same thing, but it's only for that user, not for me. So how does it know we're different users? Because when I access the web server, right, I have something called a session object that gets created, right? And it lasts, the default life of the object is about 20 minutes. Okay, so when I'm actually, even if I go away and come back, I'll remember that I came back, right? It remembers me because of a bunch of different things. Where I'm coming from, my IP address. It takes a look at things like my MAC address sometimes. What browser am I using? It's called the user agent string of the browser. All kinds of stuff to understand who I am, as well as a session ID, right? My session ID is maintained. Remember, because I'm using ASP.NET, I have a view state. Takes a look at that too, right? To keep track of the session. So think about the session as a container, again, like application, but only for users, each specific. So Eddie, you and I come on the same website. We have an application state object. We see you're logged in, I'm logged in. We both see that, right? But when I go to my table and I click, I sort my table, your table doesn't get sorted, only mine. And I use my session state object to sort my table, to remember which column I clicked on, so then when I refresh the page, it'll sort that page. But for you, it doesn't do it. You have your own session state object for ascending or descending, as an example. I can make a session object. We're going to do that, by the way. When we get to the next piece next week, we're going to be talking about data-bound controls, right? It's going to bind our controls with the database, right? And what I want to do is eventually sort the controls or add paging for the controls, right? But I want to be able to keep track of paging and sorting. I want to be able to do that, right? And I'm going to do that by using session variables for individual users. Okay. So that's the difference. So it's exactly like session. We use them the exact same way, but we do it independently for each user. And again, the other thing we can do is we can set the timeout so it's different. Instead of 20 minutes, we can set it to 5 minutes, 1 minute, 3 hours, whatever you want. You can set the session so it lasts longer. From a security aspect, you want the session to be as short as possible. Why? Because if the person goes away and there's no activity for 30 minutes, you want to kind of log them off, right? And a lot of times we store login information in two places: our session object, on a person's computer, right? On a person's browser. We're going to talk about cookie in a second too. All right. So where do we put that? Well, this is the best place to do it, is the session start inside of our global ASAX file. So an example would be, if I want to reset the timeout, I'm going to go into my session start method of my global ASAX and change the session timeout to like 15 or 5 or whatever I want. And then for every user, because it's global ASAX, it's global events that happen across the entire website, every user will have a session timeout of 15 minutes as opposed to 20 minutes. So the session object will expire, right? Application object never expires. It's there for life. It's the life of the application. That's why it's dangerous. Global object, right? The more global objects we define, the slower the application goes, because it has to retrieve all those objects every single time. Every page load, it's going to have that information, right? Because they're going to that data is going to live throughout every single page, right? Whether you use it or not. So be careful. Limit your application variables to the bare minimum. Only when you need to use something, right? And if you want a special effect that you can't figure it out, as a workaround, only temporarily. Get rid of it after if you can. See if you can do it with session variables, because session variables will expire, right? Cookies. Think about a cookie as the same idea. It's a container, right? So the container object of the cookie, instead of it being attached to a session object, right, that maintained for each user, or an application object that's being maintained for everybody, right? Cookies are in the browser. So why would I want to use cookies? We use cookies for a bunch of things. One, I want to know your username, right? Or I want to know your information, your profile information. Like, for example, Tom Sidiopoulos. No one wants to remember my last name. Come on, right? So you store that stuff inside a cookie, right? So when I go to a site, it's going to say, hey, we remember who you are, Tom, right? By the way, I also remember your credit card information, and I remember your choices, cookies. That's why a lot of sites you go to and you don't even know what's happening. Like example, Amazon.com. If you're going to shop at Amazon, it keeps track of stuff, right? It tracks stuff like cookies. It actually adds cookies to your browser, right? And if you clear your cookies, if you ever go back to those sites, it won't remember your password. It won't remember your, your purchases. It won't remember any of that stuff. So a lot of times, that's why we use something like a private window, like incognito mode. If I go to incognito mode with our Chrome browser, if I go new incognito window, right, as an example, right, this won't keep track of cookies. It won't track, right? It won't remember who I am. It doesn't remember my credit card information. It doesn't remember anything. So a lot of times people use the incognito window, right? However, from a security perspective, don't be fooled. Yes. Right. It would know. It would know. Even if you did 20 fake email IDs, if you invited them, right, it would still, it would check the email to make sure it's real. They have ways of checking email nowadays. And a lot of times more sophisticated players like Amazon don't even try it, right? Amazon is very, very good. Remember, it's the #1 retailer in the world, right? Like we talked about, it makes like billions of dollars every minute. Not joke, no joke, right? So, so any delay, any kind of stuff like security, things like that, would wreck Amazon, right? So that be sure that they've checked all that stuff out. They've already gone through those scenarios. But here's something that I want you to know. Even though I'm using incognito window or the private browsing window with Firefox, right? Please don't think it's private. Better to use DuckDuckGo, right? So I don't know if you've seen this, DuckDuckGo, right? DuckDuckGo is another browser, right? It's another search engine that you can use. It's combination. I would use it within my incognito mode. So if you use Google as an example and you use incognito window, you're still being tracked, right? But DuckDuckGo, if I search for something, like let's say Toronto, right? It's another search engine that basically it doesn't track anything, right? And notice it says, hey, set DuckDuckGo as your default search engine. It's a lot safer and does not track like Google. Google, they track everything. Anytime you go anywhere, anything you do, it tracks with Google, right? So please be careful. I mean, don't think just because I'm using an incognito window, you can see that the incognito window is gray, right? They're not being tracked. I'm telling you this stuff because that's what we're talking. We're talking about cookies, and cookies is the #1 way of doing security, believe it or not. Even though security is, even though it might be they might put hash information. So there's not like clear text that's put inside the cookie. You don't know what it means. It might be a 256-bit hash. You don't know what it is, right? But it's being tracked and it's being on your browser. And if I want to do something like clear my cookies in my browser, let's do that. So clear, if I want to do it for Chrome, if I clear cookies for Chrome, it tells you how to do that, right? So there's some instructions on how to do that, right? And you can do that for everything, including things like your iPhone and iPad app or anything else that you put up there, right? You can clear your cookies. If you don't care about it, especially the cache and cookies, we cache things on our browsers. For example, images are cached a lot in our browser, right? If we go back to a site, because we've gone to that site before, it already cached the image. And where is that cache being held? On your machine, right? So imagine every time you go to a site, your cache is just adding to your machine, just adding stuff to your machine, files. There's stuff adding in. So the more sites you go to, the bigger and bigger that cache gets, right? Dangerous. I mean, so I can go back and check your history and see every image you've ever seen, right? Which some people don't want me to see, right? So clear your cache, right? Or do not track. Use some kind of do not track browser, like an incognito browser, right? With DuckDuckGo, as an example, instead of Google Chrome, right? I'm saying just from a security standpoint, it's probably better to do that. So those kind of things you want to do. You want to clear your cache. You want to clear your cookies. You want to disable. You can also disable cookies, right? So people can't put cookies on Chrome, but that means that you can never store passwords. And you have to kind of balance. Security is all about a balance between convenience and safety, right? So you got to think about it. So, do I really want to be inconvenienced every single time? And a good example of that is two-step authentication, right? I really want to put in a code every single time I log into a site. And if it's a site you're always on, meh, I don't know. It depends on how important it is. But if I'm on a banking site, please inconvenience me so I don't lose my money, right? They don't steal my stuff, right? I don't want that to happen. So I'm okay with inconveniencing if I log into a banking site, right? But please don't inconvenience me when I'm on Facebook, right? Because if my friends get a bunch of messages saying I hate you all, right? They're gonna say, Tom, is everything right? Everything okay? They're gonna know something's not right, and then I can always go back and say I've been hacked, right? And they're not gonna get mad at me, right? Chances are. But there's really important stuff, like for example, on GitHub, I highly recommend two-step authentication if it's some kind of secure website you want to keep track of. Use two-step authentication with GitHub, and use it as much as possible for really important stuff. Okay, that's a little bit of security. It's kind of off topic, but I want to talk about it because we're talking about sessions and cookies and caching, which is all part of the stuff we're talking about here. So this is what this PowerPoint's all about. Am I going to give you examples of how to do this? Right now, all I want you to take away from this is think about these different containers we can store data, all right? In the future, when we go forward, you're going to see that session variable, and I don't want you to sit there and go, Tom, what the hell is that session variable? What is that, right? It's a session object, and we're making a dynamic variable that we're storing stuff in. And a good example is that when we want to sort, like I said, a table, I want to store for that particular user, right, in a session object. Am I sorting ascending or descending? Which page am I clicking on, right? Do I want to see all the pages or only 5 pages at a time, right? Those are the things that we can do with session variables, right? So I want to do it from an application standpoint. I want to avoid using application objects altogether if I can, right? And cookies should only be reserved for stuff that's going to make the user more convenient for the user, not for me. If I use stuff that's going to make myself more convenient, like for example, I want to cache his IP address. Oh, thank you very much. Oh, welcome back, Tom, right? Back on my site. I'm like, how the hell do they know my site? Because I store my user information, right? I don't want that to happen. I don't want them to know who I am. Chances are most people won't like that, right? But we do it anyway. Like example, if I go back to Amazon, right? If I shop, because I shop on Amazon. If I go to Amazon.ca, hello, Tom, right? Most who I am, right? Because I go on shopping on Amazon, right? Now, for me, do I really want to log in every single bloody time I go shopping on Amazon? No. And there's other things that Amazon does that stops me from automatically buying stuff. Like my kids can't go buy, and then they just spend all my money, right? But because I prevented that from happening. But I could make it that easy, right? But I'm giving you an example. Most of these kinds of sites, they will cache if you let it. And I can also track things like my orders and my wish lists and all this kind of stuff, right? But remember, there's a bunch of security aspects now there's a bunch of security that I'm already taking care of. For example, I have to be logged into my machine. Sometimes I have to access my machine, to get that. And how important is it for me? GitHub, if I want to, and if I go to my account settings, and let's take a look. If I go to settings, as an example, you can go to security, and you can enable things like, first of all, it knows where I am, right? But you can enable things like two-step authentication, right? Two-factor authentication right here. I can set it up if I want to. Again, if you're saving things like, for example, secure websites or people's websites that you're dealing with for clients, I highly recommend. And I shared that with you. Did I share with you that GitHub pack for students? You got it? All right. So if I go to student GitHub pack, right? Here's my student GitHub pack, right? Again, we did this for our the game guys, right, on Saturday, I think, right? But for you guys, if you want to get your GitHub pack, again, for the people who want to get that, you can go, if you look for GitHub, you can get unlimited private repositories, right? Normally $7 a month if you sign up to this GitHub pack. So I'm going to put this back on. I don't know if I have it on our Slack channel. Let's go to the Slack channel for a second. I don't think I have it here. Did I add it in? I don't think I put it in here. I'm going to pin this up there. So if you want to get your free stuff, I'm going to put it in here. So I'll paste it under general. right? So this is the GitHub pack you can get for free, and I'll pin it on here so you guys can find that. I highly recommend that you sign up for your GitHub pack, right? A free GitHub pack. Okay. Hey, you know, I might as well do it for the guys who are doing mobile application development. I might as well put it there too. So I'll say, you know, free GitHub pack. Students, since I'm here, why don't I just kill two birds with one stone? Right, so here we go. I'll pin this on for people so they can get it. Pins general. There we go. Okay, so a couple things we talked about. We talked about, just a recap for, and we'll end for today. We talked about how the master page, just to clarify, and the content page smashed together on the server side, and then on the client side, and that's one thing I didn't draw. Here's my client side box, right? On the client side, it produces this rendered page, or the rendered page is having on the client side, right? The server side, what it does is it takes these two pieces, these two components, the master page and the content page, and then it renders the this rendered page happens. It renders this page at the end, right? Which is on the client side. So the final HTML page, and again, you can't see this link here. Oh, there we go. Make this bigger. The final HTML page gets rendered on the client side. So I get my index.html, right? Like if I go, for example, and again, I know you guys have seen this before, but if I was to run my page, you can see that. Let me stop this. The page stopped, right? Let's do this again. So if I run this page again, right? So here's my page. And if I go to my default.aspx, right? So this is what it looks like on the front end, right? But how does that look when I view source? So if I go view page source, you can see that I've got aspects of my master page. So here's my head, right? This head page right here, right? As well as things like my title and so on. And then my body is all this, right? But notice that my nav bar, here's my nav bar, all this is up until including my form. Now notice, do you see a form anywhere here? Because remember, my form is, this is all about web forms, right? But do you see a web form that surrounds my container? This is my main, this is my main content right here. This is where my content placeholder is. We don't see a web form here at all. There's no web form, right? Because this is the final rendered page. This page has been created by taking both the master page and the content page and putting them together. That's what this is, right? So this is the HTML, the final HTML. And notice there's a bunch of other stuff that is here as well. Like for example, you know, the browser link stuff and the view state and a bunch of other stuff here. This is the view state value, right? Make sense? So this is what's rendered. That's what we call rendered. It's rendered to the client side. So we take that away. And we also talked about those two or three different ways of storing data, right? I've also talked about putting stuff up on GitHub. Now the page I put on GitHub for assignment 1, even though I was fooling around today and I went around and said X, because you didn't finish. I was kind of fooling around with you guys and bugging you a little bit to start, right? Remember that I'm going to say this again for this time. This time, there's no value assigned to me going around saying X, you lost something. You didn't lose anything, right? It's just a friendly push to get started on your assignment number 1 because people haven't done it. We're at week 3, people, right? Your assignment number 1 is due next week, Friday, right? So if you haven't started it and it's Wednesday, you have a little bit more than a week to finish it off. And there's a lot of stuff, a lot of details. This is about you, right? So this is going to tell me, first of all, it already told me who's already started to work and who's either busy or you know, or is not really concerned about starting their stuff on time, right? It's already told me that, right, about you guys. But the thing that I want you guys to do is push you to get going because there's lots of stuff going to happen next week. I'm sure you got other assignments happening, starting, labs, tests, whatever, all kinds of stuff going on. Don't let it go because it's not going to help. Okay, questions before we end for the day. Bunch of stuff. So part of it was lecture, part of it was just recreating stuff, your website, something that you haven't seen before. Yes? The contact me page. All right, just for Javid, since you're asking. If you really want to stick around, guys, you can. I'll do it for you guys. Okay, I want to do my contact me page. And I was going to talk about this next week with the contact, with the pages. So how do I set that up? Remember, my contact me page, if I was going to look at that, thank you for that, by the way. I don't have it up here, I don't think. Let's just kill. Oh, yeah, there it is. Here it is. All right, so this isn't any good, this contact me page, right? It's not good because all I have is my contact me. But I want to add in a couple things. Now, notice what I want to do is I want to have a label and I want to have a text box. A label and a text box for each of my items. Okay. Here's something that we know. I know I'm going to use Bootstrap. So if I'm going to put labels and text boxes together, right? I know it's going to be form stuff that I'm going to be doing, right? I already have a form, so I don't have to put together another form itself. So let's get, this is done, by the way. Let's look at some of these components. Now I have my nav bar. I've done this nav bar stuff, but I want to really focus on forms. And forms, I believe, are on the next page, on the CSS side. Sorry. Let me make sure that we do that. So we're going to focus on our design, right, in this particular case. Because we already have some stuff that comes, we don't have to work so hard. This is your example, right? I want to do this. Well, here's what I notice. I notice that there's a form group. I'm going to put that CSS class in there, right? I have a label and I have an input, but I'm not going to use the input. That doesn't make any sense, right? Because input is going to be handled on the server side. I don't need my label to be handled on the server side. I can put my label on the client side. Remember that there's certain controls that you can put both on the server or on the client. And whenever we use run at server, we do that round trip. The more controls I put on run at server, the more round trips I'm going to make when I render my page, which means slow page load, right? So I only want to render things that I want to access on the back end. Like, for example, this stuff here, all the inputs, I want to convert them to text boxes. Okay, but my label is going to be its own. Notice that the form itself is already pre-created. So I could do a couple things. I could grab an example of all this, which I recommend. Let's do it together, right? Since you're asking, Control C or Command C, and go over to my page, right, and paste. This is valid code, and it would work, but we're not really doing a round trip, and I want to be able to handle things on the back end, right? I don't want to handle things just on the front end, because I could do validation on the front end, but it wouldn't do much. Now, this is really important, my form group, so it looks nice, right? And I may want to put this in another div tag that gives me a smaller amount of columns in the middle, for now, from a rendering perspective. Now, we want to change this input control to make it so that it is not an input control. It is a text box. And the way to do that, of course, if you don't know what it is go to my toolbox. Notice that I have some standard controls, right? And one of them is this text box. Here's my text box right here. Text box is like an input, but it runs on the server. So here's my text box. Boom. My text box has an ID, right? And so does my label. I want to match these two things up together, right? By the way, there's a faster way, a better way of doing this thing, but we're gonna walk before we run. All right. So my email address is the first thing. Email and password. Meh. I don't want email and password. And by the way, let's get rid of some of this stuff because it's all repeated, right? I don't care about checkbox. I care about the button, right? And we won't say submit. We'll say send, right? Well, for now, we'll come back to this button in a second. So let's get rid of everything except for the first one. Do a quick form just because you're asking, right? All right, now we've got both the text box and this is the type. Okay, notice, remember, we have a control here. This is like a control we put in our Windows forms, exactly the same, right? If I go to properties, and if I look at the control properties, my ID is text box 1. That doesn't make any sense. This is going to be my first name text box or my name text box. Let's do that, name text box. So it holds my whole name, right? Or full name text box. If you want to go specific, you can always go first name, last name. Let's make it first name, last name, just to make a more of a prolonged example. Right? First name text box. There we go. First name text box, right? And because I put it here, I want to put it here, right, in my label. My label should say, oops, sorry, Control V, not V, Tom. First name. This is what this is the link, the text first name. Now, the great thing about this is that my text box, because it's a text box, I want to make it's not going to be email, right? That's not the type. It's the class is form control. I need this class, right? Because I want to style my text box so it looks like a Bootstrap text box. But I can't use the keyword class because class means class, as in like C# class. So we need to use something called CSS class. So we're going to go CSS class is equal to, seriously, it's going to be form control, form-control. Notice the same control. That's why I did it this way. All right, placeholder. Can I use a placeholder for that? So it says first name. Can I do that? And if I go placeholder, can I do that? Placeholder? No. Is there something that's in my properties, right? Like text, right, would be the placeholder. I could put it in there, right? And I also could put something called required. Now required, right, is not a property that comes up, but what I want to do is set it to true. Okay, required is equal to true. Because I want my text box to be required, right? So it won't allow me to enter stuff in. Okay, let's go back. So now I have my pattern for my first text box, and this is my first one, right? That's my pattern. I want to do the same thing for my other controls, but I want to rename them. So first name, last name, so copy paste. Notice that when I do this, it changes this. It doesn't change that first name text box here because it's a regular label, but this one changes to text box 1 because first name text box is taken. So now I'm going to go last name text box. Take this, let's put this over here, right? And this is going to be called last name. And it's still required is true, right? That's the second one. Okay, good. Save. Now, first name, last name, email, and contact number, right? So email and contact number. All right, good. So here's my email, right? And contact number. Let's put this is just the text, right? Contact number. Since you're asking. This would be, instead of a text box, this would be the email text box. You might think, wow, this is really long names, but that's what we do, right? And contact number, this is the big one. Contact number, text box. All right, woo. And I'm going to take these things here and put them here. I'm going to take this email text box and put it here. Now, there's a different thing here. The mode that we're using. So if I go to, and again, if I go to client ID mode, right, is equal to, it's not the one. It's the other one that tells me what type it is. If I go text, control space, text mode, thank you. Text mode is equal to, what is it? Email, right? Text mode is equal to email when I put my email text box, right? So what text mode does, I'm just letting you know, is it basically changes the type, my keyboard type in a mobile device to email, so it includes the @ sign. That's what it does. And I want to do the same thing for my number, my contact number. So text mode is equal to, and then the number. So I want to do a phone number or whatever. Here it is, phone, right? So now I've reclassified everything. It looks nice, and I can always add things like other things in there, right? Now let's see what this looks so far before I got my button. My button is wrong too because the button isn't going to be run at server. We need to make my button run at the server too. Actually, you might as well finish this piece off. So here's my button. Did I miss something? Different kind of button, right? Here's my button. So my button, right, it runs at server. It's not called button 1. It's called my send button. Because I want to be able to use this because when I have a send button, I want to wire up my event on the back end, right? Not here, right? So my send button, my class, I want this. But instead of button default, so I want to do a CSS class again. So CSS class is equal to button and then button primary. Make a blue button, right? And I can make a button large if I want, or big button if I really want to. The text instead of button, it's going to be send, right? run at server, and so on. And the one thing you can do with a button is I want to make an event, right? And remember that when I create an event for the button, if I scroll down, you can see that there's different aspects, but I can go on click, do something, right? So if I want to wire up my event, right? Notice that it's going to say, hey, let's create a new event for the button. And if I double click, it's going to take the button name, which is the send button, and create a send button.click event. And on top of that, right, if I go to my contact page, that CS page, it'll create my send button click event right away. So I can do something in here, like show my stuff, all the stuff that you typed, or send that information, whatever, off to somewhere else, right? So this is my send button click event. All right, let's try this out, right? Because we did a lot of work and we don't even know how this looks, right? So we kind of know what it's going to look like, but maybe we have to change the, the width too long or too short, whatever. And we can use div tags to kind of, make it nicer. But there it is. So again, if you don't like that, if I notice if I go to here and if I click send, because these are required, all these are required, it'll stop me. And I don't have a message field yet. I could put that in as well, but notice I have to put in a Tom. Notice that kind of the cookies keeps track of my information, right? And if I click the send button, it'll go to the send box, but nothing happens. Why? I don't have an event that does anything. It doesn't trigger anything. It doesn't do anything right now, right? So I want to clear my box, right? So at least what I want is when I hit my send button, I want to clear my form, right? Now, remember, my form, does it have a name? No, right? So there's some stuff we can do later on, which we'll talk about to do stuff. But let's say, for example, I want to process my form, right? Like I want to get my information. Like I can say something like, well, debug.log, debug.writeline. Let's send it to all the information. So I want to send off, I want to print out my first name, right? Plus, what would it be? First name, text box, here it is, how it come up by .text, right? So I want to send that information. I have access to that information now, right? Control dot, use system diagnostics, right? And the same thing goes with my other events. I can kind of take all those, all the values. As soon as I click that button, right? I can have all those values: first name, last name, email. By the way, I'm not really checking the email if it's correct. I'm not doing any of that stuff yet. That's next week, or the week after. First name, last name, email, and I also want to do something like what did I say again? Phone number, contact number. So that's what it is. Let's get the information. So this is the last name text box. There it is, and this is the email text box. See. And this is the contact number. There, right? So now when I click it, it's going to email this information in my output window, right? So let's try this. But you see where it is. I create the form first, and I can process it on the server. I'm already processing on the server side. Before, when we were in JavaScript, we're processing on the client side, right, with JavaScript. Now I'm not using JavaScript anymore. And we can validate both on the server side and on the client side. So Tom, autofill settings for Tom, Chrome remembers me, right? And I click send, right? And it processes the form, but doesn't do anything. It doesn't clear it. It doesn't clear the form, right? And by the way, what should the contact me do? It should probably say, thank you for sending your information, blah, 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 right? Like send me to a contact or a thank you page, right? Or some kind of message that comes up, thank you for information, thank you, it's been sent, and clear the form. That's another thing we should be able to do with stuff, right? So this behavior we haven't built in yet, right? But you can see that the form works. Now, I don't like the fact that it's so long. These columns are too long, right? I know we're over, or it's time up, I hear it. Maybe I want to make this half as long, right? And I can do that by adding additional columns within columns. I create another row inside my form. So I can say out of these, I only have 6 columns, right? I can further divide my 6 columns into 12 columns, right? So further divisions. And out of those 12 columns, how many of the 6 columns? 50%, you know, I want to use. So I want to say, well, my form is going to have, you know, I'm going to use a, you know, 6 columns instead of 12. The whole 50% of my 50%. So really 3 columns, right? If I want to. Okay, so this is what this does. What does it do? Did it capture anything? If I press the send button, did it do anything? And yeah, it did. It's right here. Like, so here's what it captured, right? Tom, it captured all of my information, right? Makes sense? So even though I did this and I didn't do anything with it, right? Again, it's still, even when I press the send button, it did that. We're going to talk next week about how to clear this button and do validation and how to check for things like an improper email address. Like, for example, if I type in anything in here, right? Not an email address, but like just this, right? And I click send, it's going to say, Matt, please include an @ symbol. But once I include an @ symbol, is that enough? No. How about just that? Is that enough? Yeah, it is. Right? That's not right. So we can use patterns, right? And regular expressions to check to see on the front end if this is correct. And we can always do the same thing on the back end. Right? Yes.
Save the data in the database?
We could. Right? We could save it in the database. We could also send, we can also use something called SendGrid with, and by the way, you have access, if you get that student pack from GitHub, it gives you access to SendGrid for free, right? SendGrid. And SendGrid allows you to send things, it's a transaction email service that allows you to send things from Azure. It actually processes a request and uses as a relay, an email relay to send back out. So if you want to get extra marks, you can use Azure with SendGrid to send a real email, like to yourself, when someone enters the, you know, clicks the send button, sends you the email, right? Okay. Any other questions? I know we went long today. Any other questions before we end? Because I want to end this off today, right? I think we've gone way too long. No? Guys, thank you so much, and we'll see you next week. Remember, next week, I'm going to check your stuff again. Next week, be sure that I will check you and say X and check mark. And next week, guaranteed that you'll lose marks if you don't have everything, you know, on the go, right?
What if it's not fully finished?
It better be started.
Oh,
I mean, fully started. Like, you should be like, I should see a draft when I see you next week.
oh, you'll see that.
Okay, let's see what happens.
Finishing touches.
All right, let's see how finishing touches is going to be. Good luck, and see you next week.